All right, today we're going to be talking about culture in the 1950s. I'm not going to lie, these are not my favorite lessons, but nonetheless, we got to get through it because there are some important things here. So here are our key terms for for what we're going to talk about today and for the lesson. The one I just want to clear up here is median family income. So the definition that you're given is a measure of average family income. So remember, what median, talking about the middle. So again, you could swap out that word with average or anything that would indicate we're not talking about the richest people, we're not talking about the poorest people, we're talking about those that are right in the middle. And then the other one, just to clear up, the reason why they use nuclear family is not because we were living at the beginning of the nuclear age back then, is think of, in this case, we're talking about like an atom. So you have your nucleus of a family, a father and a mother, and then the children, or like the electrons of an atom, rotating around the nucleus. That's why that's used. That's part of the reason why we don't use it anymore. All right, 2 minutes. Do not pause the video. Start writing. You may continue writing even as I begin explaining. Okay, so the first big thing that we're going to talk about today that takes place in the 1950s is migration. So you begin seeing a movement of people around the United States. In this case, though, it's not like other migrations that we have talked about, like what typically what we've mentioned in previous lessons, the Great Migration. This is a little different in that people are moving outside of cities to smaller towns that at the time were like their own individual, like little towns, little villages. And so many people move out that into those small towns and villages that they grow exponentially and essentially become an extension of the city. This is where we get the term suburbs. So, again, that's happened in every major city, and the notes that we have on the screen are sort of the polite way of saying this. The actuality was that you had, in terms of this migration to the suburbs, it was almost majority white, and that they were leaving cities to get away from people of color. I mean, there's really no other way of saying that. And So in these communities that they set up outside the cities, they could be highly selective, not just in who lives in their neighborhood, but then they have more control over their schools, over their kids' education, over their local businesses, so on and so forth. So they're able to create a world in which they feel comfortable, in which anything that presents anything remotely of non-comfort to them can be excluded. So on one hand, many people can kind of understand that idea. On the other hand, it's a very racist practice. So unfortunately, that's what the origin and the history of the suburbs are. And then, of course, the other negative effect of this, other than creating pockets in which you're going to have rampant racism begin to continue to breed and expand, in the cities themselves, because you have all these taxpayers leaving, cities begin to fall into decay. And what we mean by that is not just the normal decay that you might see, like potholes in the streets, but like whole neighborhoods that are abandoned, and then buildings starting to collapse because they're not being maintained. And of course, because there's nobody living there, there's no reason for the city to maintain its upkeep, because they don't have the money, because the taxpayers are now paying taxes in another town just outside of the city. And I could go on and on about this, but so this is what is going to lead to eventually, when we talk about in the 1960s and the early 1970s, where a lot of major metropolitan areas like New York City, Chicago, like even here in New Orleans, where you're going to have the cities then become pockets for additional crime, additional or things that are going to drive people out of the cities and into the suburbs. So it sort of creates this unending cycle that is going to take a long time for it to be broken, so that cities can get back on the mend and fix themselves, as well as all the other societal problems. The other part that aids this migration is the creation of the interstate highway system in the United States. Led by President Eisenhower, he got Congress to pass the bill to enact this law that establishes the interstate system as you see it on the screen. And how this helps with migration is that now you have these areas that were about 10 or 15, 20 minutes outside of a city, that normally nobody would want to move to, because it would take too long to get back into the city for their job or to go shopping or whatever, that the people moved out to the suburbs. They're now connected by an interstate system that takes that commute from, say, 30, 40, maybe an hour each day down to just a handful of minutes. So now people can live further outside of a city and get into the city for whatever they need, and they're no longer trapped in there. So that, again, that's kind of a negative. The positive of the interstate highway system alone are two, which is culturally, is that it creates a car culture in the United States. Now, the car is the major mode of transportation, not just around your daily life, but when you go on vacation, if you have to travel for work, things like that, because of the interstate system. Now you can get there faster, a little bit safer, and it's much easier. The other really big benefit to the interstate system is now it's easier for trade. So trucks begin hauling all the different goods and things that they would put on them and driving the interstate system. Whereas before you were limited to where trains could go or where local roads could take you. Now these interstates connect the country east coast to west coast, north to south, and trucks and train can get anywhere along with the regular train travel. All right, last slide. Get started. Don't pause the video. You can continue when I begin explaining. Okay, so continuing with this cultural talk. So we have three main categories here are things that are going to change in the 1950s. That, in this case, what we are talking about is, just to put it into a bit of context, in the past, we've talked about different things that were added and become part of what we would call like American culture or United States culture. Whereas what we're talking about now in the 1950s is, of course, that. But we're also talking about creating the foundation of what we have today culturally. So, and where we start with this conversation is with consumerism. So the idea that, part of your culture is to go out and buy things. And that is something that is not specific to the United States, but is unique to the United States, and that we have a consumerism culture. And I'll get into that, and I'll come back to that in just a second after we finish this. So when we talk about, going back to our vocabulary word, median family income, the 1950s saw median family income go up. Now, this is due in part to emerging out of not only the Great Depression, but World War II, but just overall the economy in the United States was very good. This was aided by a lot of the programs that we were doing to support Europe post-World War II, as well as expanding with new technologies and new types of businesses. So people had money to spend. And a lot of the companies in the United States took advantage of this. So they started updating with new technology, old appliances, starting in the home, that people would like to use. So because of electricity and now because of smaller mechanical parts, you have like electric dishwashers, electric refrigerators, electric televisions. There's only been electric televisions. But washers and dryers, things like that. These items that people can have in their home that effectively do the chores for them. And so these become, must-haves for daily life as well as entertainment. And we're going to get to television in a second. Another example of this consumerism in the 1950s is the 1950s is when we see the birth of the supermarket. So prior to a supermarket, like if you had to go get things for your house, you'd have to go to individual stores. And just to break this down just to a very simple thing, like if you were cooking that evening, you needed meat, you'd go to a butcher. If you needed vegetables, you would go to a vegetable stand or a store that specifically sold vegetables and fruits. If you needed anything else, you would go to, like if you needed bread, you would go to a baker, so on and so forth. A supermarket, the first kind of supermarket says, we're going to take all those things and we're going to put them into one store. So when you go grocery shopping, when you need meats, they're in this store. If you need fruits and vegetables, they're in this store. If you need breads, they're in this store. You don't have to go to 3 different places. You just go to one and everything's there. Now we've seen that expanded to what we have today, which is you go into even a grocery store. You can get things, not just stuff to eat. You can get items to clean your home. You can get items for your car, things for your pets, stuff like that. And then you take it a step further to a place like Walmart where you can get nearly anything. You can buy a couch along with your groceries if you have enough money. So that's what we mean by like consumerism. So it's easier, things that are easier to buy, and then items that are define your level of income, so that you can take advantage of these new technologies. And as well too, people would brag about these things, about having a new refrigerator or a new washer and dryer to their neighbors and stuff, particularly out in the suburbs. Another thing that changes in the 1950s is education. So in the 1950s, what we do see is, before there were public schools, but in the 1950s, public schools really got bumped up, and So a lot of states and the federal government, creating the Department of Education, decide that they're going to actually fund public schools. Like they were in the past, but now they're really going to do it. And this is also in part because if people are making more money, they can pay more in taxes, so therefore cities, states have more money to actually fund these schools. So public schools become a the primary form of education for almost or for a majority of Americans. And this is really just led with the idea that everybody in the United States is entitled to an education, and in this case would be for a free education. And back at that time too, was that there was also a big push to get people into college. So not only was public school free, but this is when you get public universities really begin to spring up, or at least get a lot of funding. And the idea was to make sure that a college education was affordable. That's kind of changed over the decades since the 1950s, but back then that was the idea. So all this adds to the United States because now you have a better educated populace, and they go on into other fields that are going to help the United States, such as science and medicine. So beginning in not just in the 1950s with established doctors and scientists, but you start having, like the United States really starts producing in leaps and bounds coming out of the 1950s to where, by the end of the 1960s, we have people landing on the moon, we're curing diseases left and right, and that's part of getting people into school and getting them educated. And then finally, which is sort of self-explanatory from what we have on the scene, the television becomes a major part of American culture. Even though it was invented in 1938, it's not really until after World War II that televisions begin finding their ways into people's homes, mainly through small innovations that made it possible and light enough to get a television into somebody's home. So it replaces the radio in terms of the major form of American entertainment. And they have little cliches like it becomes the new American fireplace where people gather around at night. But in itself, it creates this whole other sort of industry in which you have, now it's like, well, shows, TV networks, the three major networks had to put on TV shows. So they're going to create these shows that, along with game shows to entertain people, shows that show real Americans, and you get this form of what's considered the ideal American family, like wife, husband and wife, 2, maybe 3 kids, that nuclear family that we were talking about before. This gets ingrained in people's minds because of television. And on that note, it's, then you get to today where we have all different networks, all different types of ways of watching on your television at home, whether it's full-length movies or series, television shows and series, limited series, so on and so forth. And not only is it a form of entertainment, but it's going to become a form of getting ideas and opinions out to the American public, whether that's through news organizations or that's through fictional storytelling. And it's going to have a large impact on how Americans not just experience their daily lives, but the world around them. And that's where we'll stop today.